Let me welcome all of you to this IMC webinar, which is going to be held by Saritha Vishwanathan from Kyoto University and Indian Institute of Management at Ahmedabad. Saritha is going to give us an update on probably the largest model intercomparison study of all times. At least the largest, the by far largest that I'm aware of, with, I mean, literally dozens. I think we're close to 100 modeling teams. Yeah, Saritha is, as many of you know, Saritha is an assistant professor at Kyoto University and also affiliated with the Indian Institute of Management. And is one of the co-chairs of the IMC Scientific Working Group on National Scenarios, and is one of her first activities as one of the three co-chairs. She initiated this very large national scenario intercomparison study under the IMC roughly about a year ago. There has been lots of activity in this context. And yeah, I think I'll pass over to you, Saritha, to give us an update where things stand and where the journey is going with this very ambitious effort.
Thank you, Volker. Very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the participants. Thank you for taking a time to join the webinar. What I'll do is give you a quick status update on where we are as of now on the open call on national scenarios. I won't be able to see your questions, so please put them in the chat. And then at the end of my presentation, we could try to have, I will try to answer the questions as much as possible. And I think Pat or Lydia would be helping if we could have like the people asking questions online, or maybe someone would moderate later on. So with that, I'll just start the presentation. Okay. So what I'll do is provide a brief background, because I'm assuming many members may have seen a part or summary of this presentation if you have attended the IMC SWG meeting at the IMC annual meeting last year. And this is a little bit of update from there. So what I'll do is give a background, the open call, detailing about the open call, the data quality check, initial analysis, and the summary when it comes to SWG activities. So with the background that based on the Chapter 4 of IPCC, which was on mitigation and development pathways, it was mentioned that they have a huge amount of literature when it comes to global modeling, but not a decent amount of literature when it comes to national pathways. At the same time, you have peer-reviewed articles from international and national projects that have talked about model intercomparison studies or about in-country model intercomparison studies. And we also have gray literature like UNEP-CAP report, the World Bank with its CCDRs, and IEA presenting emissions that show national mitigation and development pathways. What we also have working in parallel, especially in the last decade, is teams in Europe, Asia, Africa, having this modeling teams and building capacity to have more number of models. And what I've done in the past year is try to collect as many teams as possible, get in touch with them to know if they would be interested to participate in this current study. With this background, there were no communities or organization, and there was a need to collect the information on national scenarios for comparability of the scenarios, and how should we map the global picture consistently from a national perspective. There was a need to tackle uncertainties as climate policies were revised and launched frequently. The national circumstances are changing drastically, and also the global scenarios were being revised. And keeping this in mind, Shinichiro Fujimori in 2021 kind of started the IMC SWG on national scenarios. The main objectives of this SWG was to promote standardization among the national scenario development activities, to increase comparability and use in assessment, interlinking the national activities to global activities, providing a platform for sharing the best practices to build capacity, to make people aware of the template, IMC template, how to upload scenarios to the IASA database, and so on, and facilitating and supporting dialogue between the IMC community as well as the national scenario users, and finally coordinating the archiving, documentation, and communication of the national scenario data and publications around the world. So when I did this initial literature review on the number of national modeling teams that are there, so IPCC kind of showed in its annex that they had around 50 teams, which also included downscaling of global models to countries. They were at every region and country level, more teams out there that actually publish in gray literature or present to the government or in peer-reviewed literature, national scenarios. And keeping this in mind, we also were in touch with country modeling teams, country energy modeling forums, and modeling networks such as the Asia Pacific Integrated Assessment Modeling, GCAM team, IMACLEM, and MessageIX, who were a major part where they were customizing or downscaling the global models for country level. With this in mind, what we started was building on the IPCC Working Group 3 AR6 Chapter 4, a study to evaluate the gaps between the current policies being implemented and the measures required to reach net zero targets at national level. The main objectives were to consolidate the modeling exercises around the world in national, international projects, facilitate discussions on national scenarios, and aligning the long-term strategies and net zero with the short-term policies. What we did to make it simpler, because we did not know if these teams had fully developed customized models or they were just using scenario tools, because we also were open to country teams from middle, low income countries to also participate. So even if they have a scenario Excel tool where they can basically submit emissions, energy, or sectoral based scenario data, that would have been fine. And again, to keep it simple, we just requested them to have 3 scenarios, which was reference or BAU scenario, the current policy scenario, and net zero scenario. Initially, we thought that 1 scenario each would be fine, but one of the feedbacks from IMC meeting last year was they would prefer to submit multiple scenarios. So that was really good feedback, and we are working on that. What the teams need to do is, what we did was prepare an initial set of scenario variables, which was shared with each of the modeling teams. And the scenario data collection and vetting process kind of ensured the data collected is transparent, consistent, but there's still challenges in this. The compilation of both the national models and the scenario database was hosted by by IASA as a part of the cooperation agreement with the IMC SWG on national scenarios. And the vetting kind of constituted the verification and validation of the model results in this study. But it is kind of just a first step. We are not trying to exclude any scenario data. It is just to build capacity so the teams know about the validation and the vetting process. Currently, we are including all the scenarios as is, as much as possible. This is just to show the progress over the last year since we opened the call in kind of January, and the information that we've had, the teams that we've registered, the submissions. So as of I think 31st Jan, we've had now 95 teams with 10 or 15 more teams coming in who may register in the next, hopefully, couple of weeks. Of these teams that have shared their information, 77 teams have already registered. The team at YASA, which Philip and David have helped register the model, so they check that the model is there in the YASA database and the teams are able to upload their scenarios. And in the last almost 6 months, we've had 40 teams, so almost more than 50% of the teams submitting the scenario. So what we want is more number of teams hopefully submit scenarios in the next couple of months. When it comes to the survey, so just to have an understanding, most of the teams who were participated in the survey were interested to participate in this study. 50% of the teams were aware of the IMC template initially, but they had not registered. More than 50% had not registered to the YASA database. The teams that were interested to participate, most of them were able to submit emission profile, which was mostly CO2 based. Few teams were able to submit the methane and 2O emissions. The teams varied across, so there were IAMs and mainly energy systems model. Very few FLU-based models were there. What was also observed were the modeling teams had a lot of uh, customized national models. So AIM, GCAM, Times, IMACLAIM, a lot of these models have these frameworks, the global modeling framework. And then when it comes to scenario submission, so initially they said that like 44% said that they would submit preliminary scenarios. Most of them may be peer reviewed, but what is really, I'm glad to basically inform that most of the scenarios currently submitted by teams are preliminary scenarios. So they are to be published kind of, so they are not already published kind of scenario. Though we encourage, if they have published scenarios, to please submit as a part of this process. Among scenarios, so when it comes to BAU or CPS, the teams alternate. Not all teams submit all the 3 scenarios, but most teams do submit the net zero scenarios. And when it comes to sectors, most of the modeling teams are energy systems based. We had some teams who have been said that they would share the agriculture land use, but when it comes to submissions, we just had like 4 teams submitting FLU based scenario data. This just gives understanding of the teams around the world. So from the 89 teams, 64 teams are national modeling teams. We have 15 global modeling teams, 6 EU-based regional teams, 1 Southeast Asia-based regional team, which has country-level data, and then 4 subnational teams, which have basically aggregated their data to give the national. When it comes to country coverage, I think last year we had 12 countries that submitted, but now we have 19 countries. So if we have 12 more countries, so we will have about 31 countries representing around the world. In terms of emission coverage, so when we talk about net zero commitment, 140 countries have committed to net zero and their emission coverage is about 88%. When we talk about the G20 countries, their emission coverage is around 76%. When we look at the coverage of the countries that have registered to the IMC SWG national scenarios, it's about 73%. But if we add the EU or the ASEAN, it would be around 78 to 80%. And in the current submission, that is the 40 modeling teams that have submitted, we are already covering 66% of the emission profile. Submission process, we faced a lot of issues during the submission process from model registration. So it was noticed that many models, because they participate in multiple international projects, had multiple accounts. So it was a time-consuming process. But what Philip and David did from YASA was shifted to one account. So every modeling team has this one account, which could be part of many projects in future if required. We created a common sheet and for data transfer. So if there are teams who are participating in an international project and want to transfer data, so that was also easily possible. When it came to submission of data, there were a lot of errors that were observed, common issues that were observed because the template was changed from the IPCC AR6 to a more simpler format. So initially I used the IPCC AR6 template, hence a lot of errors were there, but then there were other errors when it came to units that were given and all that. So we tried to solve. So I basically contacted each of the teams, or the teams contacted me, and we tried to solve all the problems. Most of the teams who have got in touch with me have been able to successfully now upload their scenarios onto the YASA database. So this is just a list of errors they faced, and we try to help as much as possible. And on YASA side, we also shared this list to the YASA team, that these were the errors that were faced, so the backend also could be improved. And we have also now developed a error slide deck where there are login issues and everything. So we will be sharing with all the teams who will be submitting in future to avoid these errors. During the feedback session at IMC annual meeting last year, one of the feedback was about adding more indicators, especially when it came to GDP or when it came to non-energy indicators, because we just had a list of 180 indicators where at a global level, there are more than 7,000 variables. The IPCC AR6 national scenarios template had 300 variables, but we just narrowed it to 180 to keep it simple. But that's something we can always discuss. If the teams are okay with submitting more variables, we are fine. Units also was a concern. Teams, especially the middle income, least developing countries, they have their units in maybe megajoules or gigajoules instead of petajoules. So that was a huge issue, but we tried to solve that. Even GDP, converting the GDP from local currency to the USD base, so 2010 base year, was another issue. Here also, a lot of the information is found on the IMC GitHub. So if teams are interested to become part of the National Modeling Scenario Forum's GitHub site, please let me know. Please, we can kind of make, you could be one of the users on the GitHub as well. Another thing was to submit several net zero scenarios. So it depends on the timing of the collection. The net zero as per team selection could differ across. And there was a request. So we have been trying to open up and add several net zero and current policy NDC scenarios if possible. One other issue that we actually observed was in EU region, there were EU 27 or EU 28. So UK was in some models not counted. So we got in touch with modeling teams in UK, and they have also showed interest to participate in this. So we also need to be aware if we are adding the regional EU model, if it's EU 27 or EU 28. In terms of data quality check, so we did the submission check, historical checks, maybe the baseline data check, but we are not including the projection checks over here for national study. And this is just a heat map to show of the 35, 40 teams that have submitted. So one can see that of all the socioeconomic variables, 4 teams did not submit the population and GDP, but most of the teams did. But when we talk about employment, GDP loss, it's very few teams that submit these scenarios across the board. When it comes to emissions, again, it varies across the team. So emission CO2, emission energy, most of the teams were able to submit this. But when it comes to like emission energy and industrial processes, not many teams were able to submit that. So from a wetting variable perspective, at a global level, this is considered one of the most important wetting variable, but we had to shift it to CO2 energy or CO2 because most of the teams were able to submit the CO2 energy or CO2 wetting variable. When it comes to secondary energy, again, a lot of teams, if they're not FLU sector based, they were able to submit the secondary energy variables, even final energy. But I think in final energy, I think it's the same slide, sorry. It's a mistake over here, but final energy also, we had most of the final energy, but not the division by fuels in the final energy. In agriculture, one can see that we just had 4 models. When it comes to methane or GHG emissions, we had 12 models who were able to submit. So energy-based systems, methane emissions, N2O have been submitted. But when it comes to FLU-based, only 4 teams were able to submit these scenario data. When it comes to the wetting criteria, so here I wanted to point out, so what I've shown over here is the wetting variables and the threshold criteria that was used by IPCC AR6, the EU Energy Modeling Forum method, and the most recent scenario compass, and the criteria about, and then what we are doing under National Modeling Scenario Forum. So here, as discussed, as you could see from the wetting variables, it was difficult to have energy and industrial processes as a wetting variable. So we shifted to emissions, but the threshold criteria could vary. So this is something we would go back to the team and we could basically vary it to 20% or 30% depending on the team, but mostly we'll try to stick to 20% based on the current analysis. We have removed the others, and even FLU, because we just have 4 teams, we have added it, but it is not mandatory wetting variable. When it comes to energy, another thing was the reference data. So the global modeling teams use EDGAR and CDS as reference data. For national modeling scenario data, we use PRIMAP as a reference data, if possible, for most of the country teams. When it comes to energy, the reference data is similar to the global database IEA. And again, when it comes to the historical variables of the wetting criteria, we have added coal, oil, gas, because most of the country teams may have one of the fossil fuel. Nuclear could be added. We are still in the process and trying to see if it should be added as a wetting variable for the national processes. The same goes for the threshold criteria. For future emissions, as well as the electricity production and the wetting criteria, most of the global modeling teams have selected certain variables, but for now, to keep it simple, and we do not have a reference for future projections, so we are not including it in the current wetting criteria. I just want to inform all the teams, this is just a way of building capacity so the teams understand the vetting and the validation process. For now, we are including all the scenarios as much as possible. If the team has not passed the vetting criteria, we are going back to the team and informing them that they have not passed, or showing them that this is what's happening. Could you just check your historical variables? And just to show what a vetting criteria does is to show that if they are out of the threshold, then you can go back to the team and say, oh, the 20% was the threshold, but you're not in that. So here one can see that if there's too much variation depending on the variable, we can basically inform the team that it is not in the criteria. So this is just an example where we use the PIC code when it came to doing the historical checks. And this is just 1 year. We have done it for 2005 to 2010, 2015, and 2020. So in the PIC code, it was like a red and a yellow. But what we've also added now is to show that if yellow is if the vetting variable was not present. So that was the reason that a yellow is there. So it is not a failed criteria. One of the vetting variables was not present. And then going back to the team and informing this could be one of the vetting variables. So that's something under discussion, that what could be the main vetting variables, and then maybe an additional vetting variable that could be added in this study. So when it comes to results, the study objective, so we had objective for modeling teams to build their capacity, to make them understand, like when it came to the IMC template. So they are aware of the IMC template, they are registered their model to the database, they understand what the vetting process is. For YASA also, it would be good, like what are the errors that the national teams faced, and from our end, what were the errors when we were providing the template to the teams. And for scenario users, it was more like to generate this evidence base, and then hopefully that's, if it gets validated, can be aggregated and then maybe compare it with global scenarios, alignment of the short-term NDCs with the net zero, LT-LEDs and the net zero scenarios, and identify the similarities and the differences between the scenario data that has been submitted at the country level. So this is just an example of at a country level. So we had about 10 countries from Asia, 5 countries from Europe. Currently, we have 3 countries from Africa, but I think maybe 8 countries, 7 or 8 countries in Africa are interested to submit, 2 countries from South America, and then 1 country from North America, that's USA. So hopefully we'll have more countries by end of. So it's a pretty good list of countries that we have, and more than 40 modeling teams across these countries. So this is the population data, the GDP data, the emission data across the scenarios that are being submitted. And this is just an example of if you aggregate. So we aggregated the 8 countries. These were part of the top, I would say, largest emitter countries. Russia is missing. So I think there's a difference in the 2005 number. So Russia is missing over here. But otherwise, you could see that the aggregate numbers falls between the IPCC C8, C13 kind of scenarios. This is also like to show the share across countries when we talk about, so across countries, the coal share in their primary energy is decreasing. The gas, depending on the countries, is in the line of 10 to 25%. The biomass share is increasing in the primary energy, and obviously the wind and solar share is increasing, especially in the net zero. And this is across countries we just did. But this we also have at a country level. This was just an illustrated example to show. We are also trying to do what could be the energy transition indicators, so emission per capita, for example, across countries wherever they have submitted. Energy intensity of GDP is another way. And then now we'll be looking at each of the NDC targets across these countries and trying to check if they are aligned with their NDC targets in the short term and in the long term. So, and then the next process, just to let you know, so we've collected this scenarios, and this is courtesy the Scenario Compass Initiative. So all country level scenarios are collected in the IASA database. We doing the vetting. We are trying to have initial analysis. One of the deliverables that we have is a peer-reviewed paper. So we want to kind of submit that paper hopefully by end of May, June. And then the second deliverable we would want is a kind of synthesis report that documents all the methodology and the relevant analysis that we've done through vetting and validation, hopefully by end of this year, early next year. And how could this be used is obviously, one is if you would want to publish the database on IASA's website itself, or we could also participate in the UNEP gap report, depending on if the country teams are interested. We can publish the data again on the basis of the country teams, whoever is interested, on Scenario Compass database next year, and compare it with the global teams that are downscaling it to the national level. So that could be another kind of a deliverable for next year. And hopefully, if we do a good job, we could obviously also contribute to the entire IPCC process. Hopefully, it would be much more easier, in addition to giving an evidence database to the users later on, which could include policymakers, investors, businesses, students, and so on. So to just summarize, when it comes to standardization, so in the phase 1, we've now had 95 teams across 31 countries. They are aware of the template. They're aware to a certain extent about the vetting variables, but when it comes to increasing the data from 180, do you want 300? So that's something, hopefully we go back to the team. If we get a good feedback, we can increase the variables. The reference data right now is PRIMAP. Another thing that we could do in the short term or long term is develop national database reference data if required. When it comes to interlinking, as shown that we could basically also become part of international projects or exercises that are going on, and also participate in outreach events if required. And it completely is depending if the team is interested. Whoever is interested will facilitate these kind of interlinking of activities. Platform. So we organize these webinars. I try to interact as much as possible with the teams at an individual level. And now I'm trying to have meetings at a country level if we have a group of country teams who need help with the understanding the template or submission of data and everything. And now we also have we've published a new survey on sectoral submissions. So there are many national modeling teams around the world that are sector-based. So we would like to also encourage that. And we are facilitating support and dialogue. So this is work in progress at country level. And when it comes to publication, I mean, possible journals could be the Nature series, Climate Policy, Energy Climate Change, and obviously the documentation through synthesis report. So this is roughly the timeline. So what is important is for all the teams who are participating for paper, rough timeline now, the final deadline is March 31st. But when it comes to synthesis report, July 31st, so it could be tentative. We are trying to have a final draft of paper submitted by May or June end, if possible. And then synthesis report by end of this year, if possible. So now it comes to discussion points. So I would open it to the floor if you have questions. Some of the discussion points are about the vetting criteria, about the modeling, the time frame of the models, because we've had from 2005 to 2100, but many modeling teams are only submitting till 2050. The emission coverage is different across. Sectoral coverage also is different. And then improvement when it comes to submission. We are trying to do that, so please bear with us, please be patient. And if you have any kind of feedback on data quality check, the vetting process, we are open to that. So, yeah. And also, if you have any feedback on the timeline or analysis, that would be great. And I think I'll end saying that there's a national sectoral interest survey that is there. So if you are interested, and this is for each sector, so power sector, industry sector, transport sector, building sector, agriculture sector, forestry sector. So they would have sectoral models, and we are looking at it at a national level. And we are encouraging teams around the world if they are interested, so we can then start the next process on collecting scenario data. Thanks. So if you have questions, I'll just...
Saritha, just there's a couple of practical questions in the Q&A section. One was largely more broadly, not specifically for this exercise, but maybe you can comment on the exercise, the degree to which current climate change impacts and potential feedbacks resulting from these impacts, whether these are covered. Roberto and I responded, but vaguely. From the perspective of the national model comparison, could you quickly reflect on this?
So impacts, so one of the things we observed when it comes to impacts is we have gathered primary energy, secondary energy, final energy variables, but we did not collect the capacity variable. So that's one of the feedback, that if we maybe collect the capacity variable, we could address the impact questions indirectly, but yeah, but when it comes to like power transmission losses, I'm not very sure. The efficiency, I don't think so we can address those questions, at least not in the first study, but maybe in the subsequent study. Like if you are doing a power sector based sectoral study at a country level, this could be one of the questions that could be answered at that point of time, but not in the first study. We are not trying to, and it could be kind of a limitation, we can say, but it was, I don't think we thought about impacts when we were creating the open call. It was more collecting and seeing and the scenarios that they submitted at that point of time. So yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. There were kind of a couple of practical questions in addition. One, will the presentation be shared that you just showed?
Yeah, I think we have shared it with the teams who have submitted the scenario data. So I will be, I'll share mostly with the teams that have submitted the data for now. And it's basically, please not to share it with anyone further, kind of a thing, because it's work in progress. But yeah, yes, we just share it mostly with the teams who have submitted because it's their scenario data. And yeah. But
Yeah.
I think this recording, this webinar is recorded, so you could always watch the webinar if required. Yeah, so that's another way of...
Thanks. Yeah, there were a couple of more specific suggestions on some of the material, how it's being presented. Then there's a question regarding from Nico related to the vetting, in particular when it comes to near-term developments. Do you basically plan to check on how well some of the national pathways are aligned with recent developments, or stuff that's in the pipeline? Is that something being taken up here?
Not in the vetting, because vetting may exclude that, but we may want to comment on it in the results section, saying that it may be like too high or not feasible or something like that. For now, I think I'm not very sure if we do the vetting, if the scenarios would pass the initial vetting process for the near term. But we are trying to also compare it with their NDC targets. So that's one way of just checking if it's too high, if they've overestimated or underestimated. So we can go back to the teams and just check with them. This is what we are getting. Is this what you're trying to say? Something like that. So yeah, we'll have more of an internal discussion than have like excluding the scenario altogether. So I mean, we do not have, as of now, for the first study, any near-term vetting processes, but we are trying to make the teams aware that this could be one of the checks in future. So please be aware of that. And then, so it's more of a one-on-one kind of, depending on the teams who have submitted the data.
Okay, so you're looking basically for a dialogue with the teams,
Yes.
instead of putting hard criteria that may prevent the submission. Okay.
Yeah, so we informing them that in future, if, for example, they are part of certain other processes, like if there's a hard criteria in IPCC, like they're aware that this could be a hard criteria in future. So they are aware of it instead of not being aware of it. So we are trying to do that as well.
Great. There are a couple of additional comments or questions that just came in. One specifically on the vetting from Hewan. Let me read this out. As for vetting, we'll likely find that the global vetting actually violates national data, given that there's also inconsistencies between global and national data sets. We've seen this in the US and China, where global data sets being used for vetting actually violate national data, something to be mindful of. Is that something you've also come across in your in the vetting so far?
Yeah, so many of the global models, they have downscaled to national level, and they don't pass the vetting criteria in many cases. That is one. But when it comes to violating, as in they don't pass, is that what the question is when you say violating national data?
I mean, I think more broadly speaking, the national data deviates from the global data set. Actually, I see Heyman has raised his hand. Maybe he can explain interactively. Heyman, can you come?
Yeah, I think now he can.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, do I have the mic?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thanks for leading this just really powerful and so much data-oriented project. My comment is just on the vetting side of things, is that we've seen in US and China case that the vetting criteria based on the global data set is actually incorrect. And they don't actually, they're vetted out by the national data. Does that make sense? So national data, if the vetting criteria is within plus minus 20% of the actual value, the national actual value by EPA is different by more than 20% with the global data.
Yeah, so here, I think, let me just go back quickly. So that is one of the reasons when it comes to vetting, what I've done is also, you could see over here, we've kept it open. So we don't know, but we could go back to the teams and say that this is, or we can kind of, from a national perspective, understand, because I've also observed in India, depending on the reference, it's not only the emission, but energy reference data that you use. So if you use a national database as a reference data, and then compare it with the global reference data, there's a huge difference. So I think that it would be better that as like a national, all the national teams understand the vetting process, and then inclusively we say that this is the range we want to put in for the current study, or we inform them, and if they are okay with it, and then come back. So we are not, I mean, global thresholds are used as a reference point, but they are not used as a standard for the national study as of now. One of the main reasons being what you actually said. So even over here, like 20% is a reference point, but it could be 30%, and it depends on the data, and then just discussing it with the teams and how they would want to. And this is something also now with the scenario compass, also informing the global teams that are downscaling that this is the process at a national level that we are doing. Just, I mean, obviously somewhere down the line we would try to reconcile, but right now I'm guessing it would be different what's happening at a global scale. For certain criteria, it may be almost similar, but for certain variables, even the variables that we choose, like initially the variables that were chosen, coal, oil, gas was not there, but we had it for the national level data because most countries could be a coal production or a coal consuming or fossil fuel production or consuming country. So we thought that it would be a good way of vetting, but also it's just a trial and error from our perspective as well. I hope I've answered the question, but I'm not sure.
Yep, that
Yeah,
makes
thank you.
sense. Thanks.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Sarita. There are then two questions that basically boil down to 2 points to whether it's still possible to submit national scenarios to the exercise in time for the analysis. Could you clarify this?
Yes, it is possible. And if we have not been able to get back to you, please, I have tried to, because I get many emails. I've tried to get back to teams as much as possible. If I've not got back to teams, please get back to me and we'll work with you. We still are in the process of accepting the national scenarios till next month. So I think Jungling, please get back to us. Dai Nong, yes, you can submit national scenarios, and we will encourage most teams, even regional teams and global teams, to submit national scenarios because that is what we are doing. But in case you're submitting global scenarios, for now it's okay. But for the paper, I think we are only focusing on national scenarios. So that's something I just want to inform everyone.
All right. Then there's one more question related to the vetting and basically what is meant by near-term vetting near-term changes and why this is necessary at all, given that policies can lead to changes that do not conform to historical trends. So could you explain what you imply here specifically?
Yeah, so in the national scenarios, we are not looking at the near-term vetting, but near-term changes generally from a global perspective is considered from a feasibility or sustainability kind of concern. So feasibility concern would be that depending on certain historical trends, you cannot have more than 300 gigawatts of nuclear by 2030, no matter what. So it's more like a feasibility or a sustainability concern, like in bioenergy, there would be certain thresholds. So it's more at a global level that they are looking at this near-term changes, but also Volker is here, so he could explain For the near-term changes, I think, yeah, I mean, in national studies, we are not doing it, but it is generally if the trend seems infeasible when you're looking at a scenario at global or country level, then when you're comparing it with the historical trend of that particular country or at a global level, hence the vetting is required.
Okay. I mean, I guess sometimes what is considered as vetting is also kind of the base year levels, right? Whether they align with statistics, and there, of course, the challenge that Hewan mentioned also comes in that national and global statistics are not necessarily agreeing, on all sorts of data points. So there's sometimes definitional issues. There's more than one history is what we learned from this. There's one further clarifying question from Chel Hong, basically asking whether he understood correctly that current vetting results are available to modeling teams who already submitted. I mean, I guess this is about the point you were saying.
So for the Korean team, I think earlier last year, I was planning to have with all the Korean teams, all the Chinese teams, all the country teams, and if possible, regional teams meeting about their vetting results, which hopefully I'll be doing in this month and next month. So they have an understanding of their scenarios that they have submitted at a country level and in their model. So yes, we will have hopefully country level or a regional level meeting and feedback session on the vetting results for each of the teams. So it's much more easier.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. There are a few more very specific questions, but these are probably better individually answered on what has been happening with individual results. Yeah, not sure. Yeah, not sure whether there's any other questions. It looks like there's a couple of more very specific comments adding to the ongoing discussion, as well as individual follow-ups. There's no kind of larger, broader questions. Is there anything from your side, Saritha, that you would still like to highlight?
Yeah, so I would like to again just first of all thank you to all the national teams who have submitted their national scenarios. So at least we have more than 50% of the team submitting, so that's a good thing. Second is we would like to increase this 50% to almost 100% if possible. So in the next month, that is what I'll be trying. So please, if your model registration has not been completed, because some of the teams actually registered in the last month, so it takes a process. So please get back to me if you have any problems with errors of submitting your scenarios, errors while submitting your scenarios. Please get that back to me. I will try to get back within 24 to 48 hours, max within a week. If I don't, please send me a reminder email. And I think we will try to have another session in April when hopefully I have a first draft paper of teams who have submitted the scenarios, and maybe I'll have a meeting with them in addition to the having in-country team meetings or regional team meetings for feedback session. And finally, something that Pat and Lydia have already published on the chat box. Next month, March 4th, we have Ling Xiao Yan who is a senior editor at Nature Climate Change, who would be presenting a webinar on basically how to publish in the Nature Climate Change and just giving an overview about the journal and the editorial processes and requirements for publication. So mostly, I mean, it is for early career researchers, but if you are interested, please join the webinar. Yep. That's it from my end. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. You have my email address. It's there on the website. So
Perfect. Yeah, we're also reaching the end of the hour. So thanks a lot, Saritha, for a very engaging and interactive overview of the status quo of the national scenario intercomparison. So and yeah, also thanks to the audience for joining and asking yeah, a lot of questions, making this a very lively and interactive event. See you next time around.
thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
See
you.
you.
Bye-bye.